So I think we are all and we can start.
Great.
Okay. So everybody can switch the video on just for some minutes. What do you think, Simona? Because I don't see many of them. Three of them.
It would be nice to see our faces at least
Just
for
to
a few
start.
minutes, only to start, and then you can deactivate. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see it.
Betty, I think Betty's got a problem with her.
I'm trying to fix my camera.
It is difficult.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My camera is not working.
And Sam, if you can put your camera on.
So, okay. So, good morning to all of you. I am Paola Castelli, and I am a cognitive psychotherapist. And Simona got me involved in this workshop with you. And I am very glad to hold this workshop with my two colleagues, Antonio Onofri, who is here, and Cristina Angelini. We have been working with refugees and asylum seekers for more than 10 years here in Italy, mainly, but even in other countries like in Jordan with the Syrian refugees, in Lebanon, and Christina in many other countries. So we are very happy we are very interested in this topic, and we are very happy to share our knowledge with you and to exchange views with you, because I know you deal with many displaced people. And today I just want to present the program. The program is of 3 days, today, tomorrow, and on Friday. And today,
half days.
Half days, yes, from 9 to, no, for you from 10 to 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
And today, Antonio Onofri, he is a psychiatrist. He will talk about the concept of trauma and its effect on mental health. And he will talk about the inner experience of people who have many traumas. He will speak about some differences between complex post-traumatic stress disorder and simple post-traumatic stress disorders. And what he will speak about emotion regulation and all the signals and how we can recognize the signal of hyper and hypoarousal. Is that correct, Antonio? Yes, this is.
Yes.
Okay. And tomorrow with me we'll be more focused on the relationship between us as operators and asylum seekers and refugees, and we'll speak about resilience and how to enhance resilience with them. And if we have time, I will speak about some exercise. We will do together some exercise to improve and increase resilience with them. And then if we have time, I want to spend some words about our inner experience as operators when we are in contact with people, with traumatized people, with people that have a lot of pain. So I will speak a little bit about compassion fatigue, vicarious traumatization. And then on Friday, Christina, she will be focused on sexual and gender-based violence, because she's really specialized in this topic, in this area. And I know that many of displaced people with whom you face on, they suffered from SGBV. So she will speak in depth on this topic. That is all. I think you will do a small pause, a small break during this morning. And I cannot stay with you because I have to go to my office, and I will see you tomorrow morning. So, tschüss.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
So now I give the floor to Antonio Onofri.
Yes, thank you, Paola. And first of all, thank you for your participation this morning here. And thank you, Simone, for the invitation. So if you agree, I can share my screen and start my presentation.
So guys, I think for the interests of your internet connection, you can turn your videos off now.
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, yeah.
Yeah, okay then. Perfect, yes. Yes, you can see another participant among the auditory. He is a friend of mine, Dr. Mirmotari from London.
Welcome.
Yeah, and he is a medical doctor working in London and interested for a little time to attend the workshop. Okay. Okay. So, yes, here you can see the title of my presentation this morning, Psychological Help for Refugees, Imagining the Future in Order to Live the Present Without an Overwhelming Past. Yes, we talk about also the subjective experience of time and the effect on the subjective experience of time in the population of the asylum seekers. As Paola told you, I'm Antonio Onofri. I'm a medical doctor, a psychiatrist working in Rome in a very ancient hospital in the center of the town. I'm talking you from Rome. I live in the center of the town, a few hundred meters from Vatican State. And today in Rome, there is a cloudy weather, unfortunately. So we can start trying to identify the objectives of these 3 half days workshops we are pleased to provide you. The first objective, I think, could be to improve your ability to identify the patients, the users, most in need of help, to address them to a professional help, for example, to understand what they are experiencing and to suggest them to consult a psychologist or a psychiatrist and to have some indications for doing this. Then, to provide you information concerning the disorders coming from post-traumatic conditions. So you could have among your tools some useful informations to provide psychoeducation also to your users to help them to better understand to better understand what they are experiencing, what are the symptoms, what are the conditions in their mind, in their body, and so on. And so, especially the second and the third workshop with Paola and Christina, we would like to provide you some tools that we consider useful to program some basic psychological interventions without necessarily a big professionality. So what we are going to talk about this morning. First of all, I think it could be useful to review altogether what we know about the concept of trauma. Yes, Paola told you that I'll talk about some distinctions. I talked to you about the different types of trauma, different traumatic events and traumatic prolonged conditions. And so something about simple trauma, so-called, and complex trauma. We'll spend some time to try to describe the first emotion involved in the post-traumatic conditions, the fear. In what consists the fear? Which are the physiological mechanisms in the body, not only in the mind, of fear? Which are the so-called alarm reactions, the defense responses that we quite often see in our users. And so why, when, and how these reactions of alarm can become chronic. And our users seem not be able to feel safe again. So we'll talk about the principal diagnosis, stress-related, the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder. The name is included in the DSM-5, the main manual for the classification of mental disease from the American Psychiatric Association and the World Health Organization. And so we'll finish this morning trying to identify which are the most common trauma, in which way we can talk about trauma among the population of the refugees and of the asylum seeking. Trauma, what we mean when we say trauma? Trauma is considered by the psychopathology, by the literature, by all the story of psychiatry, a watershed event. In fact, quite often also in the words of our patients, if you do a clinical work, like me, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a psychotherapist, I see a lot of patients during my week, and many of them are traumatized, and they talk about something about their life before the event, and what happened and how their life has totally changed after the event. So they talk about a sort of precise division. Before the event, my life was happy, my life was normal, I was calm, everything went well. Now, after that event, my life is totally destroyed. My life is totally different. Nothing is any more similar to my previous life. So trauma is considered an excessive stimulus Excessive, of course, is a term related to our capacity, to the capacity of our nervous system to process what's happening. So it's an excessive stimulus that overwhelms. It's too much, overwhelms the ego, the I, the identity, stripping it of defenses and making it incapable of reacting. So we are naming the second emotion very often involved in the traumatic condition, in the post-traumatic conditions. The first, I told you, is the fear, but the second is the sense of helplessness, of impotence. I can't do anything. I cannot bear it. I cannot face it. Of course, an event can be painful. An event can be stressful. Of course, our life can be full of stressful events, of losses, of griefs, of economical problems, of problems about jobs. But perhaps these can be very stressful events, but not necessarily traumatic. So what do we mean with the term trauma, traumatic? The main characteristics, peculiarities of a trauma are the unpredictability. If I can prepare myself to face an event, usually the event is perceived a little less traumatic than a sudden, totally unpredictable event that I meet in my life. The second characteristic is the uncontrollability. I can control the event. I can face it controlling, reducing, mitigating, modulating it. So I'm absolutely submissive to the event. And any traumatic events is usually accompanied by an intense sensorial stimulation. This is a very, very important item because I'm introducing you to the concept of the response of the central nervous system. So every traumatic events is accompanied by a sensory stimulation because we are escaping for something we perceive dangerous, threatening. We are seeing something of really horrible sometimes. We are hearing something very, very fearful, frightening. We are perceiving in our body. Paula quoted the rapes, sexual violences. So the sensorial stimulation, the smell, the taste, the body perception, what can I watch during a traumatic event, usually consist in a very intense sensorial stimulation, and our nervous central system remain very impressed by this stimulation. And then we can also say that quite often the traumatic event is undecipherable, not easily understandable. What's happening exactly? Why is it happening? Why is it happening to me? What I did to deserve this? Why? why is the most common, the most frequent answer coming from a traumatic event? We can divide, we can classify the traumatic events in many ways, of course. For example, we can think in this way, to think about individual trauma. And here in the slide, you can see a long list, but the list could be sure longer, of individual trauma. Physical aggression, sexual violence, a threat of being killed, car accidents, of course, are the most common traumatic events, but also job accidents or abortion can be traumatic events. And we can start to introduce the collective trauma. And while I'm talking, I'm sure you are thinking of the many users you meet every day among the people you give help to, you give assistance to, and think about their traumas, the trauma they met. And you can see that in this list, many of them, we can find many of the trauma they met. Geological events, natural events, geological earthquakes, for example, not very rare in Italy, for example, volcanic eruptions, brutichism, and meteorological events. We are quite accustomed in Italy to assist to very bad meteorological events, torrential rains, drought, flows, hurricanes, and so on. And the hydrological events, flooding, rock slides, all these conditions can have the effects of traumatize someone, to traumatize communities, villages, entire populations. We have also to remind, we can also remind that the civil and technological catastrophes, the industrial accidents, the transportation accidents, airplane, train, ship, road accidents, the collapse of technological systems. People of my generation remembers Chernobyl, for example, or perhaps you can remember the collapse of the nuclear central in Japan a few years ago. Fires are quite common, and they have the effect of traumatizing people. And also collapse of buildings, of large infrastructures. Perhaps you remind the collapse of the big bridge in Genoa, a very important town in Italy, with the death of many, many people driving their car along the bridge, and the traumatization of all the population. Apartment blocks collapsing, skyscrapers, hospitals, bridges, overhead passes, and so on. And at last, very important for the population we are talking about, are the so-called social catastrophes. The socio-political events, first of all. So the war. War have the affects the people, traumatizes people, communities, and so on. The terrorist acts, the riots, and also, of course, the use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. But also the social sanitary events, the unexpected epidemics. You remember what happened in the northern part of Italy last year, when the COVID-19 pandemic started. Initially, we saw long lines of coffins going along the road toward the cemetery of Italy, because thousands of people, especially elderly people, died in the northern part of Italy, Lombardia, during the first phase of the pandemic. And then, of course, also the socioeconomic events like unexpected famines that brings people to escape from a very, very poor place, to displace, to going in other countries, in strange countries, and meeting a lot sometimes of other traumatic events. But till now, I talked to you about especially traumatic events, quite easily identifiable, I could say, with a start and an end, a start and an end. Car accident. At 7 p.m., I had a car accident. But quite often, or sometimes, the traumatic is not an event. The trauma is not an event, but a prolonged condition, something that comes along a phase of life, a long childhood, a long infancy, adolescence, and so on, the developmental phase of an individual. There are lives, and we all know them, that are full of multiple traumas, chronic traumas, traumas without a start and an end, but a trauma that lasts years, months, or many years, sometimes also decades. Especially when these types of trauma happen during the development, we psychiatrists and psychologists consider them particularly important, particularly dangerous for the mental development, for the construction of the personality. Especially, we consider them very, very risky, especially when they are caused by other people, especially when caused by people significant, relevant to the person. For example, the parents or other relatives. Of course, these are considered the most severe trauma for the building of the personality of an individual. But so who can suffer from a post-traumatic stress? We can identify different levels of traumatization. Of course, first of all, we have to remind the person, the individuals who experiences the traumatic events as a first person, the victim, for example, of an aggression. And we call this a primary traumatization, traumatization of first level. I am the victim of a trauma. So I had first traumatized, and this is the trauma first level. But when someone is severely traumatized, of course, also the other members of the family or very close friends of the individuals can be traumatized. Of course, if my son meets a very serious injury, car or motorbike accident, or an aggression, or my daughter, of course, me too. Also, I am traumatized because he's my kid, he's my daughter. And so I'm very feared and worried for his wellness, his surviving, and so on. And so we can call this traumas of second level, secondary traumatization. But we know that also the rescue personnel can be traumatized. For example, we have the tale of many boat operators rescuing people in the Mediterranean Sea, watching people drowning, going down the water, children dying, pregnant women dying. And of course, also these operators can be traumatized. They can be traumatized and they can suffer from the effects, the long-term effects of what they watched, what they heard, listened to, what they perceived in their body. For example, the hands of a guy in the water asking help, please, please save me. And then the hand going away and the guy going down the water and dying. So I can have the perception of his hands in my hands going away. So when we talk about trauma, we are talking about body. We are talking about sensorial stimulation, what we watched, what we listened to, what we perceived in the body, what we smelled. Think about a big fire. People many times told us that they have in the brain, continuously in the brain, the memory of the smell of the meat of people dying in the fire. We can imagine, perhaps only imagine, what this can be mean. But also, we can also talk of a third level trauma, also for the people who listen to the testimonials or look for their job into the details of the events. The operators of the camps, for example, when we listen the tales, the stories of the people we meet in our service, in our work, and they told us some terrible, horrible event, what they met in their life, for example, during a period in prison in some part of Africa. We can be traumatized. For example, I remember I have some very bad memories of this when I listened to some of the refugee or asylum seeker I tried to help. I remember some very stressful for me, some tale very stressful for me. Perhaps because there was some aspect I could more identify with that situation. Perhaps because the guy giving me a story was had the same age of my son. Or perhaps the event he was telling me was very, very horrible. For example, to be forced to have a sexual meeting for his mother I cannot forget this kind of stories. They remains in my brain. So this is a very important aspect to consider. For example, I remember last year, a girl working in the World Facebook organization consulted me from Ireland because she was in the task force of Facebook trying to prevent the pedopornographic, the exchange of pedopornographic materials in the network. And she was very traumatized because she had to control, to see, to watch and control again a lot of horrible pics regarding babies abused. So she was traumatized. Also, if she never was abused in her life, she never was, never met a sexual or a physical aggression in her life, but she looked at pictures regarding this kind of situations. So also in these cases, we can talk of tertiary traumatization. I'm talking about this because it could be possible, it could be probable that also among you operators, there is someone of you for personal experiences or for have received the personal experiences of the asylum seeker, of the refugee, that can be traumatized. So, which are the more difficult to deal with the characteristics of the traumatic events? I already told you, the unexpected nature of the event, unpredictable, the intensity and sensorial stimulation of the event, and of course, this is very closely related to the physical proximity to the event. Of course, if I'm very near the Twin Towers in the moment they are collapsing, I have a higher probability of being traumatized. And if I can see the towers only from a far distance, I have a less probability of being traumatized. The uncontrollability, and when children are involved. It's not a case that I already quoted something regarding children in my presentation. You have to consider that if in the situation are involved children, the probability of the traumatization increases very much. So usually the greatest risk to have psychological consequences are coming from traumatic experiences like this. Phenomenon of total or mass destruction or death, the genocides, of course. We all know what happened during the Holocaust to the Hebrew in the Second World War, or to the Armenian, or in the Kosovo, in the old Yugoslavia near Italy, or in Congo, Rwanda. Of course, during a genocide, we can be sure that a very large number of people will be seriously traumatized. Also, the so-called unnatural deaths. Of course, we can experience griefs when some relatives of us dies, but it's totally different if a granddad dies, an old father dies, or if my son, a baby, a child dies, an adolescent dies. These kind of deaths are perceived absolutely deeply unnatural. And so the grief can easily becomes prolonged, complicated, chronic, and so on. The death of all family members of an entire community. I remember I provided a psychological help, for example, to a refugee coming from the Kosovo. And they remembered that all the people of his village died. An entire village disappeared. Disasters with possible contamination, because you can never be sure that you won't have effects of the contamination. The effects of contamination can be overt only after years, can compare also after a distance of time. Abuse, physical, sexual abuse or maltreatment, or also severe neglecting happening during development are traumatic experiences with the greatest risk of psychological consequences. And neglecting, what does it mean? Means not to have a person to count on, providing help in case of need, providing able to give safety, to reassure me, to give me food, to give me clothes, to give me attention. Also neglecting is considered by professionals like psychiatrists and psychologists a very serious risk, factor of risk for post-traumatic conditions. I'm talking about this again because you are surely thinking of people you meet every day in your work in the camps. The traumas have a cumulative effect, and people quite often tell us. They tell us, when I lost my father, I recovered. When I had that aggression, after a while, I recovered. But when also this happened to me, it was too much, and I broke, I collapsed. So the previous exposure to other previous traumatic events represent a risk factor for developing post-traumatic disorder, for example, after the last trauma. Because I want to emphasize this in my speech. We don't think about trauma necessarily in terms of pathology, because luckily, if you meet a traumatic event, you have a great probability, at least more than 30% of probability, to naturally recover from the traumatic event you met. So you can experience a sort of disease, of distress after the event, but after a few days, usually after 1 month, or after a few months, you can restart to feel safe. No more effects, no more bad active memories in your mind and in your body. So you met a bad effect, a bad event, but now, here and now, you have no bad effects anymore. But this is true only for a part going from 30% till 50%. It depends, of course, by the magnitude or by the greatness of the event you met. But if you come from other traumatic events, your risk to develop a post-traumatic psychological condition increases. So it increases also when you come from previous psychological or psychiatric disorders. You suffered in your past from depression, from an anxiety disorder, panic disorder, bipolar disorder. Of course, you have major effects from the trauma you meet. Pre-existing vulnerability to depression, for example, is one of the most important items considered a very important risk factor. Abuse of alcohol or other substances, and also some characteristics of personality. We all have a personal and individual style to react to stressful events. We have a personal tendency to react in some way. And of course, some coping strategies are better than others. For example, if you have a tendency to react to difficulties you meet, blaming yourself, you have a bigger risk to develop post-traumatic mental disorders. But also the strong tendency to avoid the problem could be a risk factor. Or the so-called mental rumination. You wonder and wonder, you think and you think, you make hypotheses and hypotheses. Why happened? Was it my fault? Was the fault of someone else? I deserved it or I didn't deserve it. It's I can blame God, or why God is so bad with me, or something like that. Rumination, thinking and rethinking all the day for months, sometimes for years. And of course, there is another topic quite important. The social support you received immediately after the event, because low levels of emotional or social support, you don't have friends, relatives, a social network. You don't have anyone able to comfort you, to help you to remind you that now the event is over, that now you are safe. And also high levels of pressure from the environment represent risk factors. But if we mention risk factors, we have also to mention protective factors. Sometimes the refugees and the asylum seekers we meet in our work come from a quite high resilience. The resilience is considered the capacity to recover after stressful events, to reestablish a sense of safety, to reestablish a sense of security, to rehave the previous mental state that you had before the event happened. Okay, and so many of our population comes from a big resilience. They have a lot of resources, and it's important that we consider this and that we know which are the personal and social resources that our user can count on. For example, a greater capacity of mentalization, of introspection, of knowing the mental states, the emotional states, and correctly relate them to what happened in their life. More self-esteem is related to better prognosis, better consequences after a traumatic event, the ability to learn from experience, to deal with stress. Of course, there is also a sort of constitutional, genetic ability of our different nervous central systems to cope with the stress, to face the stress. Someone is more calm, more clear, more quiet as a temperament. Someone is more irritable, more inclined to guilty, to the fear, inclined to be feared. And any one of us with children, with more children, like me, for example, knows that also the newborns are different from the first minutes after their birth. So also our nervous central system is different. More flexibility, more courage, more bravery, self-discipline, creativity, humor, are religious thoughts, spirituality are all items related to a better prognosis and considered protective factors from the scientific literature. So if the trauma doesn't necessarily have the effects of post-traumatic psychiatric disorders, why someone has and someone doesn't? We usually use to try to explain, to understand this, a so-called biopsychosocial model. So we have to consider genetic, constitutional, individual predispositions, psychological factors related to all the development of the individuals, but also environment, psychosocial stress factors now, here and now. All this can have different results. Mental healthy or psychopathological disturbances. No, sorry. Okay. And the trauma, the traumatic events, traumatic conditions are always more considered very important, central from the healthy professionals, for any kind of illnesses, somatic illnesses, mental illnesses, a traumatic history is considered very central, very important. In fact, also the World Health Organization, in the action plan starting in 2013, tells us that the exposure to stressful events, especially at a young age, has been ascertained, is considered surely a risk factor for the beginning of predictable mental disorders. Vulnerable groups can include members of poor, extremely poor families, people suffering from chronic diseases, disabilities, for example, babies, infants exposed to maltreatment, to neglect, adolescents exposed to the use of substances, minority, of course, also ethnic group, minority groups, elderly, people who have to deal with discrimination and the violation of human rights. The World Health Organization talks about mental disorders, but I can tell you with absolutely certainty that many studies, scientific studies, showed as also somatic conditions depends from all the stressful events and traumatic events met during the lifespan. And now we are starting to talk about a very important topic. So what happens in our mind, in our body, immediately after a traumatic event, after a threatening event, a threat to our body, to our survival after a severe injury and so on? We have some stress reactions called alarm reactions or defense responses, usually named fight or flight responses. Perhaps you know them. In fact, the body, our body, has a sort of control system monitoring our environment and the safety of our environment. Of course, I'm talking to you doing this presentation, but if we listen to my wife screaming or smell of fire, the heat, flames from the doors, something like this, of course, I would immediately interrupt my presentation and I would have some immediate reactions to the signs of danger. The body has a system for a rapid, very rapid response to stress, which helps to stimulate many systems of our body. Here in this slide, you can see a list of what happens in our body immediately after a very serious condition, a danger, a sign of immediate danger, very near to us. And of course, it's something that happens in our body. You are not medical doctors, so I don't want to bother you talking you more about all the cascades of events, of hormones, of neurotransmitters, of so on, of what happens in our body. One of the most interesting theory of the last period that helped us to better understand what happens immediately after a traumatic event is the Stephen Porges Polyvagal theory. Why is it so important? Because it describes in a quite precise way the different patterns of reactions to a threatening condition. When we meet a danger, you usually stop, and we have the activation of our alarm system. We have a muscular tension. We are very active immobility. We are totally still, for example, trying to look to the source of danger. Where is it coming from? What can I do to face it? Is it better to escape or is it better to fight? But of course, these are very, very rapid responses, very, very rapid answers. There is no necessity to think about. Then, if the danger is quite far from me, I usually, my body, my central nervous system chooses the way of escaping. The danger is far, the aggressor is far. I can escape, I can flight, okay? And or is it more near, closer? I prepare, my body prepare itself to fight the source of the danger. And this is the activation of the sympathetic system, the orthosympathetic system. What happens in my body? The frequency of heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, muscles become contracted. The blood comes to my head. The blood comes to my muscles because I'm preparing myself to escape or to fight. Okay? I think that all of us know this kind of fear. And when we think about fear, we are used to think of fear in terms of movement, action, agitation. But this is only partially true because we have another system called the dorsovagal system, part of the parasympathetic system, which brings me to different responses, especially when the aggressor or the source of the danger is very, very close to me. I cannot avoid him or anymore, avoid it or him anymore. For example, when he is raping me now, he's already raping me. Or for example, when his or her knife is already entering my body. Or perhaps when I completely tied in the total impossibility to react, I have some different responses to the danger. I have a passive fear. I can experience a different kind of fear. I become still, passive, my muscle become weak. I experience a sense of weakness, of I become curved, I mobilize myself, I can, my head goes down, perhaps my shoulders go down, I become submissive, I can pray, please don't do this to me, please, please don't do it, I can cry, but I can also experience a sort of numbing. I can become dizzy, I have an unclear mind, and in fact, sometimes I won't be able to clearly remember what happened. And this kind of fear can exit also in a fainting. Okay, in fact, we talk about we mentioned the responses now in terms of freezing, fight, flight, fainting. Okay, and in fact, this kind of response, the dorsovagal system, the dorsovagal system innerves the internal organs of my body, the viscera, the bowel, for example, the heart. The blood comes away from the head, from the periphery, and goes in the central part of my body to save what is really becomes really relevant now. Okay, the central part. Also because the blood going away from the periphery and the platelets concentrates in the periphery because I'm becoming ready to a bleeding. And so I can try to save my blood. There are some interesting physiological aspects, evolutionary based. And of course, these are trials of save myself. All systems try to save me, escaping, fighting, but also mobilizing me. Perhaps someone of you watched some interesting videos by the National Geographic. You can see antelopes, for example, and the lions is very close to the antelope. The antelope becomes suddenly still, goes down. It looks like dead. The lion is a noble animal, doesn't eat corpses of dead animals. So also the lion stops himself and goes away. And the antelopes, after a while, restarts to escape. So all these can be considered survival mechanisms. There is also another mechanism invented by our evolutionary history. And so we are talking about the ventrovagal system. The ventrovagal system is activated when we can have a social engagement, when we have someone near us able to talk us with a calm voice, with a smiling face, with careful eyes, loving eyes, caressing us, hugging us, giving food us, giving clothes us. This is the ventrovagal system, able to make us feel comforted and secure, safe again. Of course, to be activated, we have to be able to approach someone near in our environment, near to give this kind of help to us. In the slide, you can have a sum of what I'm talking about: fight, flight, freeze, irritability, loss of temper, fight. What I mean? I mean that usually these reactions last a while after the danger. When the danger is over, the event is over, is finished, you look at the situation. Now I'm safe again. Oh, how lucky I was. I'm safe again. I can feel myself secure, safe, calm, but sometimes this doesn't happen. My fight, flight, freeze, faint reactions become chronically active. And this happens when we develop disorders after the traumatic conditions. We continuously have a sort of reactions very similar to these ones: irritability, anger, loss of temper with everyone I perceive as aggressive, withdrawal, defensive. I'm always on guard. I'm hypervigilant, or I'm avoidant. I'm continuously closed in myself, withdrawal, social retire, anxiety, fear, numbing. I feel like there is a screen between myself and other people. My head is always in the clouds. I cannot concentrate. I cannot learn the new language of the new country where I am. I'm feeling like if I was continuously giving up. I faint sometimes. So normal defensive responses to high threat can become prolonged and can impact also the relationships of the refugees with the new world, with the operators of the camp, with the health professionals, with the treatment adherents, and so on. Yes, we can go on. So at the first, in 5 minutes, we'll have a break. After the first moment after the event, the individual have the alarm reaction, and so a state experiences usually a state of physiological hyperactivity, cannot be still, or feeling of incredulity. Really? Did it really happen to me? I think I've been exposed to something too big, too difficult, too painful to bear. Something that overwhelmed me, goes beyond my ability to face, to bear. And so I can start to ruminate. I feel I still feel under threat. Also here, also now. I'm in a safe place now, in a safe room, in my house, but I'm still feel under threat, in danger. As if he or she would be still getting ready to deal with the danger, ready to escape, ready to fight, ready to faint, to submit, or to trying to avoid something that really happened, so you cannot avoid it anymore. So we can see a constant mental repetition of what happened, looking for the causes, searching for the responsibilities or the fault of. And like if this could make the person able to not to let what happened go in the past. So the sense of alarm could be very high for days, usually, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. In this period, and perhaps you can see this kinds of phenomenon also in your population of the asylum seekers and refugees, we can see a lot of startle reactions. A sound, a sudden sound, a sudden presence of someone entering the room, and you can see the refugee, the asylum seeker, with a startle reaction. The person is ready to flee again, to fight again. The body is ready to do this again. But usually, gradually, this kind of reactions tend to fade away. They are normal, I told you. And the guy realizes that there is no longer any danger. She is alive, is safe now, and so she can start to deal with the consequences in the best possible way. The support of others become very important because the others are able to reactivate the ventrovagal part of the parasympathetic system. The other are able to calm, to reassure, to give presence, proximity, availability, and of course, food, clothes, a safe place, and so on, smiles, calm voice, and so on. And of course, there is also an ability of the individual to reassure themselves. Of course, we also have a sort of relationship with ourselves. But in this, after a danger, is very important, the presence of other significance. But as I already told you, sometimes this doesn't happen. So we have to see what happens when we meet people with some sort of psychopathological responses. So we now can have a break. At 10:45, we can restart our workshop, and we'll talk about the psychopathological consequences of the traumatic events, traumatic conditions, and so we'll go toward the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And Simona, do you agree?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Onofri. We'll come back at 11:45. Guys, please make sure you're back at your desks by 11:45 and that your microphones are muted again. Thanks, everyone. See you in a bit.
Yes, it's okay.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I hope that this presentation could be really helpful for you and for your daily work. So we talked about the concept of trauma till now, traumatic events, traumatic conditions. We talked about the reaction, the defense system, the alarm reactions, the different kind of reactions, and we talked about we introduced the knowledge, the observation that sometimes the individuals can meet difficulties in having back a sense of safety and of security after a very serious threatening danger. Of course, we saw how many factors are involved in this to understand the different exit for different individuals, the kind of trauma, the proximity to the trauma, the long-term trauma, the development conditions, and the previous trauma, and so on. So now we'll try to describe, to talk about what happens when the individuals remains with a feeling of danger, also when he or she is not in danger anymore. So we had to go to the DSM-5, the main manual for the classification of mental disorders, and looking in this manual what we can find about the psychopathological responses to a trauma. In the manual, in the DSM-5, we can find an entire chapter. Please deactivate your microphone if you can during the presentation. It's better for me. We can find an entire chapter completely dedicated to the so-called trauma, stress and trauma-related disorders. Another chapter for dissociative disorders, considered one of the possible a spectrum of disorders related to trauma as well, and other non-specific disorders. In fact, I already told you that a trauma, a traumatic events, and above all, a traumatic prolonged conditions can affect an individual in many different ways. So if we don't think to the trauma necessarily as a psychopathological condition, we don't have to think to a psychopathological conditions only as a post-traumatic stress condition, because the traumatic events, the traumatic conditions are the are risk factors for the developing of any mental conditions, any mental disorders. You can suffer from a depressive disorder, an anxiety disorder. You can have a relapse of a previous psychotic disorders. You can have a stress trauma-related psychotic disorders. You can develop an eating disorder, anorexia, bulimia, somatoform disorders, and so the entire DSM-5 you have to consider, not only the post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the main disorder described in the chapter trauma stress-related disorders. Of course, we'll talk about the post-traumatic stress disorder because it is the main disorder trauma-related, not because it is the unique, okay? And there are also in the chapter of trauma stress related disorders, we can find also the reactive attachment disorder or the inhibited social engagement disorder, only regarding the children. Of course, children can suffer from a different symptomatology after a trauma, essentially with nightmares, and they can show their feelings, express their fear in the plays, playing and so on. Post-traumatic stress disorder, and we talk essentially about this one, but also acute stress disorder, adjustment disorder, and other disorders trauma-related. There is also very popular in the scientific literature, but not totally considered official, not completely shared. There is not a shared agreement, the complex post-traumatic disorder and the post-traumatic stress disorder in remission or sub-threshold. But I told you that many other disorders you can suffer from after a traumatic event or conditions. Sexual disorders, eating disorders, personality disorders, of course, and depressive disorders. But let's go to see the diagnostic criteria for a post-traumatic stress disorder. Why I'll talk of this to you, also if you are not healthy professionals, not medical doctors, not psychiatrists, essentially because it can be useful to see the list of symptoms and the diagnostic criteria to be more empathetic with our users. Better we know the subjective experience, the subjective world, the feelings, the phenomenon happening in their mind of our users, we better understand them, better provide the correct information, the correct explanations. We can provide the so-called psychoeducation. Don't worry, many individuals suffer from this after the events you met in your life. The events you met are extraordinary. So it's quite common that the fear, the impressions your brain received remain in your nervous system, in your body. There is a memory of what you lived, and what you lived remain active in your mind and in your body. For example, we can think, to better understand what I mean, what happens after a long travel on a boat, on a ship. You go on the earth, you arrive to the port, to the earth, and after going down from the boat, from the ship, you tend to feel yourself unstable, like if you were still in the sea. Something similar happens after a trauma. The sensations, the feelings, the thoughts, the sensorial stimulations remain active in your memory, and you tend to react to all this memory as if it was real, now still present. In fact, we have to consider that our brain is not perfectly able to discriminate, to distinguish a memory from the reality, an imagination from the reality. We can have body reactions anytime we have a memory active in our brain. An active memory in our brain becomes active in our body. We can have a fight, flight, freeze, faint reactions to the memory, not to an event anymore present, but to the memory still present in my mind, and the brain reacts. So in our clinical work, we not easily, because it's quite difficult sometimes, we help people to let the past into the past and to convince their brain that now, here and now, they are safe, far from that danger. Okay, so let's see quite quickly the Ptsd diagnostic criteria. The DSM-5 talks about trauma, and for the DSM-5, traumatic is the exposure to death or the threat of death, serious injuries, of course, sexual violence, of course, any kind of sexual violence, also without sexual penetration, in one or more of the following ways. We told this in the first part of my presentation. The person experienced the traumatic events directly. The person was present when someone else experienced the traumatic events. He or she was a witness. It's traumatic if you see someone else killed, for example. The person learned of a member of the family or close friend having experienced a traumatic event. In the case of death or threat of death to a family member or close friend, the event was violent and accidental. Or the person is exposed to a repeated or extremely detailed account of the crude details of the traumatic event, as I already told you. But it's important to see that not any stressful event is traumatic, but the exposure to death, threat of death, serious injuries, sexual violence. And it would be interesting to ask you, if we were in a dialogue, in a common dialogue, to investigate how many of the users present in your camp lived this kind of traumatic events, exposed to death of someone else, or living a threat of their death, serious injuries. How many of them lived experiences of very harsh imprisonment or torture or sexual abuse or so on? I think many, absolutely many, probably the majority, the great majority of them. Of course, there are also the asylum seekers escaping only from extreme poverty, misery, to improve their economical conditions. But how many of them lived traumatic conditions during their infancy, childhood, adolescence? How many of them were exposed to neglecting, to abuse, maltreatment, and so on? In my experience, in our experience with refugees and asylum seekers, the absolute greater majority of them. Usually, the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms are generally grouped into 4 types of symptoms, and we could see them more in details. Intrusivity, something that continuously enters in my mind, also when I don't want to have. For example, I'm an asylum seeker, arrived to Italy, I'm trying to attend the class of Italian to learn Italian, but I cannot follow the lesson because I continuously is intruded by the bad memories of what I lived. The second cluster of symptoms is avoidance. I try to avoid the memory of what I lived. I am engaged in trying not to think or to pretend not have lived those kinds of things. I don't want to think of them anymore. And also negative changes in thinking, in cognitions, in representations of the world, of the others, and of myself, changes in mood, something like depressive symptoms. And of course, changes in physical and emotional reactions, hyperarousal of the orthosympathetic system, the fight or flight, or hypoarousal, the numbing, the detachment, the amnesia, the freezing, to be like drunk, the disruptions of my consciousness. We'll talk about this. And of course, the symptoms can vary over time or vary from person, from individual to individual. In this slide, there is a sum. We sum up what we've just told you. Which are the symptoms of intrusion? Flashback, for example. Flashback are the most severe. What are the flashback? The flashback are those episodes in which the individuals thinks, acts, feels like the event is still happening again. okay? For example, I run down the building where I live because I smell gas, and I'm afraid that the building is collapsing because it really collapsed. Another building really collapsed where I lived 2 months ago, for example. So now I am in another building and suddenly I smell gas and I run down in the street to save my life. I'm in an altered state of consciousness. I'm not anymore in contact with my reality, with the safety of this place. There is no gas. The gas smell is in my mind, and the brain, the nervous system reacts to this. So the flashback is considered a dissociative symptom. Nightmares. During the night, I quite often have bad dreams. I have dreams regarding what I lived. People drawing down, people following me, trying to kill me. Soldiers killing my family. Soldiers coming in the cell of my prison, trying to raping me. Okay, and then of course the memories. I try to concentrate in some other task. I'm trying to follow the lesson and learning Italian, English, Arabic, so on, but I cannot concentrate because also, if I don't want, I have the continuous memories. I cannot avoid to think the face of my child drowning in the Mediterranean Sea trying to get to Lampedusa or the Sicilian coast. And of course, anytime I remind, I have the physiological and psychological reactions to the memories. I feel angry. I feel feared. I feel with a muscular tension. My legs are ready to escape. My arms are ready to fight. My heart accelerates its rate of frequency. My breathing becomes very, very fast, rapid, because I'm preparing myself to fight or flight. Or otherwise, I suddenly become numbing. I feel like if I was completely stupid, astonished. It's real or unreal. I'm remembering correctly what happened. Did it happen or didn't? Was it a dream or was it real? I'm so far from anyone else. At the same time, I feel the tendency to try to avoid the memories of what I lived. I tend to avoid people. For example, that guy that asks me, where are you from? Ah, so you come from the area of war. Too many questions. I hate the questions about my experience. I avoid people that remind me what I lived. I don't want to go in that street because in that street I know that there are Italian policemen And the Italian policeman remind me the policemen of my country when they came to my house and put me in prison. I avoid places. I don't want to go to that street, to that camp, to that area, because there are something too similar to what I lived, for example. Or I want to avoid the things. I cannot eat that food because it reminds me the food of my country. I cannot wear that shirt because it reminds me the shirt of my brother dead, and so on. But at the same time, I also try to avoid conversations with people regarding my experience, thoughts, memories, feelings, emotions, internal experiences. So I feel a sort of splitting. There is something continuously going to my mind, entering my brain. And continuously at the same time, there is something continuously trying to avoid all this material present in my mind. Okay, so it's a very difficult conditions, a very heavy conditions, tiring. And I feel also alterations in my mood. Of course, because I feel, I experience the helplessness, hopelessness. I feel very sad, of course, very, very sad, sometimes very depressed, with any more hope. No plans sometimes for the future. Everything is so difficult. I escaped from a difficult country. I am now in a difficult country again. My life was very difficult. Now my life is very difficult. And I'm very worried for the people I lost, for my family, which is still in the country from which I escaped, for example. So I feel different from anyone else. You talk to me to integrate in the new reality, to attend the school, to look for a job, but I feel a sense of very diversity, deep diversity. No one else can really understand me, because I lived two extreme experiences. My identity is changed. I don't have any more hope in the humankind, in the human being. So I can lose interest in life, no have plans, and I have experienced a social withdrawal. Okay. And of course, if I have the physiological and psychological reactions to reminders, I have also the hype or hypoarousal. The hyperarousal comes from avoidance quite often, also from the alteration in mood and cognition, the numbing, the head in the clouds, everything is far, the reality is perceived strange, altered, different from the usual, from the normality. The sounds are different, the colors are different. So the perceptions are altered. I feel far from everything. I feel far from myself, from my body. And we'll talk about dissociative symptoms too. So I feel like if I was sleepy. Come on, try to wake up. Sometimes I find myself saying to myself something like this, come on, wake up. Because I have the sensation of sleeping. My mind is not working well. But I have also exaggerated startle response when my roommate comes silently enters the room. I have exaggerated startle response. I'm always in alarm. I feel like if in 1 minute I have to escape or to fight with someone, I'm continuously cross, irritable, anger, because it's not fair what I lived. And I don't have any trust in people. I have difficulties in sleeping. Sometimes this is a good chain to a good hook to engage the user in asking help, because they find difficulties in sleeping, in starting sleeping, in maintaining sleeping. They suffer from nightmares, bad dreams. They wake up too early in the morning. So sometimes they could ask help for this. They find difficulties in concentration, I told you. So you can see here the list of the different types of intrusive symptoms. But it's important that you experience severe emotional distress or physical reactions when you meet in your daily new life in the new country something that is really similar or reminds you what you lived. We call this, in the technical language of psychology, a trigger, a stimulus that reactivates something present in my brain. For example, I was raped from a bearded man. I meet the bearded man in the new camp. I feel the same sudden reactions of fear or of passive torture passivity that I experienced during the experience of being raped in my past. So I see the soldiers in the street. I immediately feel feared, terror, panic attacks, because they remind me, the soldiers of my countries. If I was a victim of a torture, for example, unfortunately, anyone can become a trigger for me. Any other guy I meet, any people. Why can I trust again in some human being of my environment? In the slide, you can see the list of avoidance symptoms. I already told you. And here, the list of negative changes in thinking and mood. So also hopelessness, no trust in people, difficulties in maintaining close relationships, detachment from friends, not feelings of love, of affection anymore. And this is an horrible experience. I feel so detached from anyone I was involved in. lack of interest in activities I enjoyed, feel positive emotions, and so I continuously experience a sort of emotional coartation, emotionally numbing. Here again, the list. I insist on this kind of phenomenon because these are the symptoms our users experience. I think that you agree with me. Or if you have any comment, any questions, please write them down in the chat. So at the end of my presentation, I can read them and say something more if you ask, because it could be difficult to receive direct questions. The connection is not always good. My English comprehension is not always good. So it could be easier if you write down your comments or your questions in the public chat of the Zoom platform. Also the self-destructive behavior, the self-cutting sometimes, or other risk behaviors, drinking too much, driving too fast, substance abuse, are always trials or to drive the anger toward myself, to try not to express toward other people, or to regulate, modulate my emotional states. And of course, I can think it was my fault. I wasn't able to protect myself. It was my fault. I didn't do enough to save other people. The fault of the survivor is quite common. I feel shame. I cannot say what I lived to anyone. The committee for the refugees, for example, calls me, but I don't tell them that I was raped, for example, because I feel too shame to tell someone else what I lived. The shame is another emotion, very common, very frequent. So it becomes very difficult to construct a coherent narrative of what I lived for many of our refugees and asylum seekers. In fact, there is also a program, a treatment called narrative exposure therapy, because the narration is important. In many cases, in my experiences, people were refused as refugees. They didn't receive the status of refugee because they weren't able to remember correctly. They were still too confused, too numbed, too confused. So they experienced amnesia, partial amnesia of some aspects that they lived, but sometimes they decided not to tell what they lived because they experienced too shame in doing this, and they received a refusal to their to their asking refugee status. Okay. I go faster. Yes. Now, I told you from the beginning of this presentation that many of our refugees and asylum seekers don't come from experiencing of single traumatic events, but from multiple traumatic events, not with a time-limited duration, difficult development, traumatic events, maltreatment, physical maltreatment, neglecting, something like this, sometimes during their family life, domestic violence, for example, or being bullied, for example, or discrimination toward their ethnicity, for example. But then they experience the period of war, period of scarcity, famine, a period of bombs, a period of imprisonment, of tortures, and so on. And then the story of the escape with many traumatic events during the escaping. So complex PTSD is related to chronic traumatic situations, conditions that continues, repeats for months, for years. And they suffer from something more severe than only PTSD, as I described to you, using the DSM-5 criteria. They suffer from additional symptoms, for example, changes in their self-concept, very low self-esteem, very intense self-blaming, very loss of trust in other people. And Judith Herman of the Harvard University suggested a new diagnosis, complex PTSD, to describe the symptoms of long-term trauma. Or someone else proposed disorders of extreme stress, because torture, for example, is an extreme stress. There is another human being coming in my prison every day to torture me. It's horrible. It's unthoughtable. Another work group proposed the diagnosis of developmental trauma disorder for children and adolescents. And the treatment becomes very difficult in this kind of complex post-traumatic situation. Captivity is very frequent in this kind of situations. Physical, emotional abuse, the situation in which the victim was under the control of the perpetrator, unable to escape, unable to fight, everything was unusual because you stayed still under the control of the violent aggressor. Concentration camps, of course, prisoner of war camps, but also prostitutes coming from brothels, long-term domestic violence, physical, sexual abuse. So the complex trauma is repeated, prolonged, serious, and usually interpersonal, caused by other men. Till now, we talked about past and recent traumatic events and conditions. And all this kind of material is not easily processed by our brain. Why? It's so difficult to convince the refugees and the asylum seekers' brain that now they can trust others, they are safe, they can receive help, because quite often they are an ongoing traumatization, still active, caused by their current living conditions, at least in Italy. I don't know in Egypt where you live and work. But the living condition that this population of asylum seekers, displaced people find in the receiving country play a role almost equal to that of the trauma suffered in their homeland. The symptoms of complex PTSD are alteration in the emotional regulations, suicidal thoughts, for example, self-cutting, intense anger, lack of control on their own emotion, alterations in the functioning of consciousness. We are introducing you the concept of dissociative symptoms. The patient feels detached from their mental process. For example, can watch himself or herself from the external of their body, out-of-body experiences, can experience an alterations in self-perception and in the relationships with others. There is also some distorted perceptions of the perpetrator. They could think that the perpetrator took the possessions of their mind, that entered their body and their mind and is still present and controlling themselves. So something that seemed a delusional disorder, but it's a very severe post-traumatic stress disorder, not a really psychotic disorder. They can attribute a total power to the perpetrator. They are continuously worried for the relationship with the perpetrator, like if the perpetrator would be still present in their new environment. Isolation, social isolations. The world has no order anymore, no sense, no meaning. Everything can happen to everyone. There is no way to avoid the horror of the life. There is no hope, no help, no faith. Sometimes we meet people with loss of every sense of life. And they can start to drink alcohol or use other substances as a way to avoid and the numb feelings and thoughts related to the trauma, to regulate their very stressful emotions. Or they can easily be re-victimized because they have lost any way to protect themselves, to correctly recognize the signals of a danger. So it's more usual that they have no more trust in others, but sometimes they tend to be too trusty because toward people who don't deserve it. And the body conditions is very important because a complex PTSD is usually accompanied by some sort of body symptoms, somatic conditions. We, for example, in our experiences, we noticed that poor people coming from the central and part of Africa tended to express emotional distress in a different way from Western people, essentially through their body. Their body maintain a very strong memories of what happened to themselves, but sometimes they have no connections. They don't have the awareness that that pain in the arm, for example, or in the back is the consequences of the torture. They cannot do the connection because their mind doesn't work anymore, doesn't work well anymore due to the traumatic situations that they lived. Somatic disorders are frequently brought in our experiences to the clinician's attention, but very often these somatic disorders without an organic base quite often are only the expressions or an unreferred post-traumatic symptomatology down the somatic expression. I mentioned due the dissociation. Dissociation is the discontinuity, the disruption in aspects in the flow of consciousness, of identity, memory, physical actions, amnesia, feeling a sort of detachment from myself and feeling not to have any more control on my mind, on my thoughts. The reality around me seems totally different, like a movie, like a dream, like a nightmare. I cannot have any more the control of my body. I feel my arm, my hand completely detached from the rest of the body, for example. And this is a great problem for the daily functioning in working, in studying, in relationships, and so on. Okay, and the dissociation is an effect of the traumatic events, and at the same time a defensive mechanism to escape the feeling of terror and impotence still active in the brain, in the mind of the refugee and of the asylum seekers. Yes, so in fact is a defensive mechanism that the individual uses, of course, out of the consciousness to try to split the traumatic events, the memories of what happened from the daily life. The stress of war, also the stress of big events, tsunami, natural disasters may cause dissociation. It's more common in children. It's more easy for them to step out of themselves as their identity is still forming, constructing. And of course, the dissociation is not always present, can be shown when and worse during the times of new stresses. They cannot remember correctly what happens. They feel confused, dazed. For example, they can have dissociative fugue, escaping in a dissociative state from the place where they are living, detachment from oneself. They don't know anymore who they are. Good, bad people, brave, coward. They have no more sense of strong identity. a presence, the sensation of a presence of multiple people talking or living in the head, feeling of possession by someone else, suicidal thoughts, unwanted but present. So, going to the end of my presentation, we know that there are many reasons back the escape of our asylum seekers: political, ideological reasons, international civil wars, religious intolerance, ethnic intolerance, of course, also more simply economical reasons, of course. Of course, this kind of population is influenced for their mental health by a list of factors: the personal history of attachment, of family history, of course, their previous personality. Everyone is different. We talk about refugees, asylum seekers, but they are different, deeply different, as we are different. Any individual is unique. The experience of prolonged war, the death, the disappearance, the loss of family members, also during the escaping process, the torture, the long duration of the traumatic conditions, and the randomness of choice of Egypt. So no having a clear migration project, or they like to reach Sweden or Germany, and so they are forced to stay in a different country without good plans, good perspectives for their lives. They felt prolonged separation from family members, sometimes from babies, from children. They feel the obstacles, they meet the obstacles to rejoin their family members. They have no employment, no job, no real protection sometimes. And so they could have experienced a loss of status. Sometimes they are people coming from a good status: journalists, psychologists, medical doctor, coming from a life of wellness. They could have experienced the political repressions because part of a minority or political opposition, with all the tension, fear, threats, etc. As an effect of this, famine and war, the tension, torture. Okay, so the normal life cycle is interrupted by events which determined their necessity of escaping, their necessity of leaving the country. They lost loved ones, and so is escaping really a choice, or they are forced to escape. The escaping implies it's not a desirable status, because it implies a traumatic interruption of existence, the breaking of the sense of continuity, a weakening sense of identity. Loss is a very important item also for our basic interventions, and not only the loss of dear ones, the griefs, but also the loss of the physical place where all the affective, intellectual, spiritual, material capacities developed. of the mother tongue, of the mother culture, of the usual behavioral, communicative habits of one's or an individual in his or her own culture. And then they have suffered an attack to their ability to establish relations, especially if victims of torture. We have no time, of course, to go more deeply in this very, very important topic. But I hope that I have given to you some stimulus to better understand, for example, an individual coming from an experience of torture and the trigger that he can meet in the daily life. I remember, for example, a Kosovo patient. I was having a clinical interview with him, and then I told him, please, now will make you an electrocardiogram. Please lay down. Of course, he accepted laying down on the bed for the electrocardiogram. We took the machine of the electrocardiogram, and suddenly the guy stood up and escaped from the room and from the hospital, because only after we knew that he was tortured with electricity. And so the vision of the electrocardiogram was a trigger to experience a dissociative states. I'm still in that horrible prison with those horrible individuals. I have to escape to save my life. And in Italy, we know refugees and asylum seekers coming from very bad experiences in the sea. You know how many people died and how many people were saved and rescued from our soldiers in the sea and brought in Italy. So we have to consider that our populations probably lived trauma before escaping. Disappearance of relatives, griefs, separations, torture, prison, violence, and so on, of course. But they lived trauma, and they are living traumas perhaps also after the arrival. The uncertainty, the fear of expulsion, the cultural shock, the fear of the audition, the committee for giving them the status of a refugee, the language difficulties, the difficulties in seeking a job. And so what trauma? A lot of trauma, many trauma before leaving their country, upon arrival. And so the trauma that we have to consider for better understand their mental conditions are coming from an ancient past, a recent past, the present, and quite often are trauma still going on. And so I could say that almost always where we, in the refugees, we are talking about complex PTSD. And so we have we meet people with emotional instability, tension-reducing behaviors, substance abuse, guilt feelings, and a lot of psychiatric symptoms, body symptoms. You can see the list in this slide. And so, first of all, we noticed that no real psychological, psychotherapeutical help is possible without at least the minimum stabilization of life conditions. Quite often we met people receiving the status of refugee, dramatically improving their status. And someone recently, after a recent ameliorment of their status, worsening suddenly after receiving a denial of their status of refugee. So the stabilization of life conditions and also of psychological stabilizations is indispensable, a very important condition to any kind of psychological help. But about this topic, we'll talk you Paola Castelli tomorrow and Cristina Angelina on Friday morning. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that my speech could be at least a little helpful for their important work. And I can go to read what someone of you wrote to me. In complex trauma, you mentioned that there is a trauma that has no starting and no ending. No, not a precise starting, no precise ending. So if I was abused, maltreated, heavily maltreated, physically maltreated in my family, it regards probably all my infancy and my childhood, not only 2 times, not only on January 1968. It's a prolonged conditions. There is not a secure date, and probably I don't remember exactly when the physical or the sexual maltreatment, abuse started. We work on helping people distinguish between the past and the present, exactly. That we are here and now where there is no danger, exactly. It's the same for us. My question is how we could work on that if the danger is still ongoing somehow and is uncontrollable. Yes, I think that I told you something about this at the end of my presentation. If the life conditions are too unstable, for example, sometimes they have to change the place many times during a year from a camp to another. The operators change. There is too much instability. We cannot do a psychological appropriate work. Of course, we can provide the first help in this case is a social, I could say a social political help, a place, a safe place, food, clothes. And when the conditions become at least a little stable, we can think about a short-term duration psychological treatment. But this is a condition. For example, it's absolutely easier to treat refugees than asylum seekers, because usually the asylum seekers are still in a too unstable situation. I hope that I have answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Onofri. I have one more question. Does anyone else have any questions they would like to ask? If you've got the time, Doctor.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, if you have a question, you can write down or try to
I have one question. I was really interested to hear you mention about the difference between Western societies experiencing more dissociative states and developing countries or African countries in particular experiencing the trauma more in the body and having more physical reactions. We see physical reactions quite often in the center. We're dealing with walk-in clients who may have just experienced a traumatic event, or may be having a reaction to a previous traumatic event. I'm interested to see if you have any thoughts on why there might be that difference.
Yes, I think that first of all, I could say the different culture, but also the different education, because it's usually more usual that people coming from developing countries, especially from some areas of Africa, for example, couldn't receive any kind of education. So it's very difficult for them to have the words to communicate their mental states and their difficult emotions. And so the body tells on their behalf. But this is true also for the rural parts of the ancient Italy. Probably my grandparents expressed their emotional states with the body more than I do. So the education is surely an item. And also the sharing culture. Of course, if you come from high education, you are a writer, a journalist, you have a lot of words, a lot of, a very rich inner word to communicate this, but sometimes it's not this way. And then probably also the metaphors shared by the culture is more probably are bodily metaphors.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for us to think more about how trauma is stored in the body, and I think like there is a tendency for some people to think that it's more of a experience that you have in your mind, and I think it's really good for us to kind of shift that focus onto what happens in the body, particularly as well, because it might help us to understand people's physical reactions or people's behavior in the center. And we're dealing with clients with diagnosed PTSD all the time in our case management, but actually a lot of our emergency response, the daily emergency response that we're doing, is as a result of challenging or unusual or unexpected behavior in the center. And I think that all of this, actually, this presentation helps us to understand a bit more some of that behavior, and it's the understanding that's important when you're dealing with these situations in the moment. So yeah, it's really helpful. Thank you so much.
I hope so, and I think that tomorrow Paula will tell you something basic, for example, exercise involving the body to try to activate a reflex of relaxation in our assisted people. And so we have to consider that many of the techniques used of our therapeutical tools used in the psychological help for refugees and asylum seekers use body. Body and imagination are two many very important ways to deal with the symptomatology of suffered from this kind of population. Okay, so
Great. Thank you.
I hope you a nice day and a nice workshop tomorrow with my friend and colleague Paola, and on Friday with Christina. Thank you again for.
We're looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye
Have
bye.
a great day.
Bye bye. Thank
Bye
you.
bye. Thanks, everyone.